Hello everyone and welcome to the round glass review for the Nikon PC-Nikkor 35mm f3.5. In that name, the PC stands for perspective control, and we're going to talk about how to use this lens in that manner throughout this whole video. Nikon introduced this lens in 1962, and the typical lens uses for a PC or perspective control lens like this are always called out as architecture. But you know what? While, yes, this lens was used by some photographers for that, and in fact, if I remember correctly, the Nikon manual that came with this lens even said you could do that. I'm actually going to say that that's not really what this lens was best at by any stretch of the imagination. This was a tabletop product photographer lens because you could use the close focus point and the shift function to eliminate things like lighting glare from photographs of watches, glass, or jewelry. Now, one quick note on vernacular. This is a perspective control PC lens, and that means you can correct the perspective. This is also a shift lens because it can be shifted on a plane parallel to the image, film, or sensor's plane. This is not a tilt lens, and the lens cannot be tilted to alter the relationship of the lens and plane of sharpest focus unless you have a tilt adapter for it for your mirrorless camera. And I did try that, and it was, I don't know, it was okay. I could see it as having some uses. For your bottom line up front, this lens is great when focused close and stopped down a bit. At infinity, it's pretty trash. So the more you spend with this lens racked out to its closest focus point and stopped down f5.6, f8 in that range, or a hair smaller, the happier you're going to be with the way this lens performs. Your focal length and angle of view are 35mm and 63.4 degrees on full frame, an equivalent of 53mm and 44 degrees on APS-C, and, 27mm and approximately 77 degrees on GFX. The aperture range is 3.5 through 32, element and group count are 6 and 6, design type retrofocus, filter size 52mm. Your closest focus point is 0.3 meters, which in the US is 9.475 standard SD card lengths. This lens offers shifts from 0 to 11 millimeters with the capability to rotate through 12 detented positions, each of them at 30 degrees, and with the marked and recommended maximum amount of shift in millimeters for each detent printed next to it. The drive type is manual focus only for both focus and shift. The native mount is Nikon F, specifically the pre-AI or non-AI Nikon F mount. Dimensions are 70mm by 52mm, and the weight is 290 grams. With the tilt adapter, you can have a full range of motion with this lens too that can change the lens's character quite a bit. So for mirrorless shooters who want more perspective control than just shifts and you do want to do some tilts, look into a mirrorless to Nikon F tilting adapter. Next up, for GFX users, you can shift this so far that you will reach the end of the image circle on your GFX sensor. But this lens does really have a pretty gigantic image circle, and I used my Sony a7 IV to calculate the maximum image circle where you will start to get vignette, and it's 58mm wide. Now that will not cover 6x6 by a long shot, unless you want to have black corners on your 6x6 image. If you are, however, willing to crop to 16:9, this lens could flirt with covering 645. But GFX, yes, this lens covers it quite well, and as a 35mm lens for product photography on GFX, this could be an interesting option if you're willing to live with some of the technical compromises that a lens of this age requires. At infinity focus, this lens is uninspiring at best. Up close, I do like it quite a lot, and it really does work very well there. Another tip on this lens, it can be used to create image stitches. This is not at all a new idea coming with the advent of digital photography, by the way. The manual for this lens, which is reproduced in the 1001 Nights of Nikkor link in this video's description, details how to do image stitches with film. But in a nutshell, Simply rack the shift all the way out for your first image, then rotate the lens 180 degrees and keep the shift racked all the way out. Then presto, two negatives that can be placed next to each other, and because the lens was rotated, the center will have the same illumination, assuming the camera's shutter speeds and aperture were left the same and everything's working mechanically correctly. The dots test chart shows that this lens has quite soft performance and strong bending of the dots around the full-frame image perimeter. By modern standards, this is not great performance. Even by the standards of when this lens was made, it apparently had a relatively mediocre reputation, if I recall correctly. But this is all wide open, and this lens does perform better when stopped down to around f5.6 to f8. Shifting this lens 11mm to the side, we see strong chroma smearing and noteworthy light loss that will affect image illumination. This, by the way, could be useful for sunset photos. Fun tip. Performance when rotating the lens shows also how the pixels on the monitor, which are more in focus than this photo due to a slight monitor to lens sensor misalignment on my part, are smeared noticeably along with the white squares. This will translate into image quality loss in a significant manner and means that with strong shifts, you will want to have a solid background to avoid the image quality compromises that this lens makes at those significant shift ranges. And that means specifically a white or a black backdrop with a tabletop product photo will mask maximum shifts with this lens fairly well. At infinity focus, lights are illuminated pretty well and evenly. At the closest focus point, they exhibit spherical aberration overcorrection and strong blurry area perimeters. And these light test shots, by the way, were both at zero shift. Here's a classic early 60s air-gapped retrofocus design. If you just showed me this diagram, I'd consider it pretty boring. That it's so small and covers such a large image circle, well, that's actually quite special. This was an early lens, and later lenses such as the 35mm 2.8 PC lens used additional correcting elements and different element shapes to improve upon this lens's performance character. Breathing is noticeable but not awful and still shifts from at or near the closest focus point to 0.7 meters further. In video, breathing is likely to be fairly imperceptible to most people, and that could be a nice element in close-up focus shifts with this lens. The aperture is stepless with a preset ring that has detents at each full stop from 3.5 to 32, except for f4. The front element is non-rotating but does move in and out 16.5 millimeters. The focus throw is 190 degrees with a near but not quite stationary focusing ring. Focus damping is good and pleasing for focus, but with my lens at least, the shifts do not hold in place, and that's the shifting screw, not the focusing helical, by the way. And that's especially true when making vertical shifts, where the weight of this lens, I can shift it upward, but then under its own weight, it will start shifting back downward. The autofocus effect on audio is not applicable, but the focusing helical does make a soft sound when being focused. Sharpness is good with a couple of asterisks. It requires that the lens be centered and shot from around f5.6 to f11. That's really the sharp range, and shifted position being 0. Sharpness drops off dramatically when the lens is shifted at every aperture. Also at f32, diffraction is incredibly strong with this lens, and it makes images, in my mind, nearly unpalatable. So only use f32 if you have no other options. The build quality is exceptional with no slip in any parts, and the components feel precise and solid. Contrast is affected quite strongly by veiling flare in some settings, especially when the sun is just outside of the frame. This further reinforces the idea that this lens really is intended for studio lighting, where you can control light placement and prevent veiling flare. Aperture stars start right in at f5.6 and get better through f22, where they peak with exceptionally long 6-pointed stars of quite clear definition. At f32, the stars drop off in quality. Out-of-focus areas are characteristic of 60s retrofocus lenses, with slightly chaotic backgrounds in settings where the lens is focused up close, and there are many colors or rapid contrast changes in the blurry areas. Distortion on full frame is relatively non-existent by retrofocus lens standards. I, by the way, did not test this out to the full image circle with shifts. This is distortion using the lens zeroed for no shift. Light loss was tested on the GFX format. The light loss is good by retrofocus full frame standards of the time when looking at the full frame area. Venturing out to the full GFX area, and the light loss is even with a pleasing gradient at f3.5 and f4, then it's mostly gone by f5.6. Flare exists with harsh lighting off frame and manifests as veiling flare. A hood may help this, but you need a very wide hood if you plan to use shifts, as a hood can also get into your frame when you start shifting the lens to one side. Ghosting occurred in one of my images, and it showed the aperture quite clearly. It's not the worst I've seen, and with studio lighting, ghosting should never occur. Balance with cameras is good because, while heavy, this lens is compact. The center of gravity with this lens on every camera that I tried it on was quite good. The Nikon PC-Nikkor 35mm f3.5 came to me as part of a lot of lenses I bought from a professional photographer's son a handful of years back. Those lenses have been slowly making their way across this channel's reviews, and I've kinda let some of them drag out because they're fun to use. This lens was, it appears, one of his more used lenses given the filter ring dent and general wear. To that end, I have to imagine he used it quite a bit for architectural photography. I understood that was one of the things that he did. He was sort of a general, all-around, smaller town at the time photographer who would do basically any photographic assignment he could get his hands on. But today, were I to use this lens for a purpose, it would be a fairly limited use lens, with studio tabletop photography, especially of reflective and shiny objects, being that use. And to that end, this lens at f5.6 to f8 can really have some very good uses in that vein, and that's really where it's worth considering this lens and adding it to your kit if you do tabletop product photography. Hey, and if you enjoyed this video, check out this other one you'll probably really like too.